A waitress refused to serve him, but she had no idea his daughter owned the place. The morning sun poured through the wide windows of a small diner tucked along the main street of Monterey, California. The smell of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the low hum of conversations. It was the kind of place where people knew each other's names and daily orders. Regulars sat at their usual booths, chatting or flipping through newspapers. It was just another Tuesday morning, or so it seemed. When the door creaked open, a hush rippled through the room. An elderly black man, neatly dressed in a charcoal suit and polished shoes, stepped in. He held a cane in one hand, his posture slightly stooped but dignified. His eyes scanned the room briefly before he made his way to a corner booth. As he sat down, there was an undeniable tension in the air, a shift that couldn't be ignored. A group of men near the counter exchanged quick glances. A woman with a stroller hesitated mid-sip of her coffee. It wasn't overt hostility, but it was there, unspoken and palpable. The waitress, a young woman with blonde hair tied in a loose ponytail, approached the tables near him. Her movements were brisk as she handed menus to a young couple, topped off coffee at another booth, and took an order from a man in a flannel shirt. But when her eyes met the elderly man's, she paused. She gave a curt nod in his direction, then walked back toward the counter. Minutes passed. The man sat quietly, his hands folded in front of him, glancing occasionally at the laminated menu in front of him. The waitress didn't return. At first, the other patrons seemed unsure of what to do. A middle-aged woman at the next table frowned slightly, but quickly returned to her phone. The young couple whispered to each other but avoided looking in his direction. The man raised his hand politely, signaling for service. The waitress glanced over but made no move to acknowledge him. Instead, she poured coffee for another table, then disappeared into the kitchen. The tension thickened. Some patrons looked away, pretending not to notice. Others exchanged nervous glances. Yet no one said a word. But something was building, a quiet storm waiting to break. As the minutes ticked by, the elderly man maintained his calm demeanor. He adjusted his glasses and picked up the menu again, though it was clear he had already made his choice. The clatter of dishes and the chatter of the diner continued around him, as if he were invisible. The waitress reappeared from the kitchen, carrying a plate of pancakes for a table near the window. She smiled warmly at the family sitting there, bending down to ask if they needed anything else. Her voice carried easily over the hum of the diner, cheerful and polite. But when she passed the elderly man's booth, her expression tightened, and her gaze flickered away. At the counter, a man in his 40s leaned over to his companion. "Do you see what's going on?" he muttered under his breath. His friend, a man in a baseball cap, shrugged. "Not our business," he replied, taking a sip of his coffee. The man in the suit glanced around the room, perhaps looking for an ally or simply trying to make sense of the situation. A faint smile touched his lips when his eyes met the woman sitting nearby with her child. She hesitated, her lips parting as if she might say something, but then she looked away, focusing on the screen of her phone. Another 10 minutes passed. The man shifted in his seat and tapped his fingers lightly on the table. He raised his hand again, this time higher, holding it there for several seconds. The waitress walked by, balancing a tray of drinks. He lowered his hand slowly, his shoulders sinking just a fraction. The tension in the room was no longer subtle. Patrons whispered behind hands, their discomfort growing, yet no one intervened. A teenage busba, who had been clearing tables, lingered near the kitchen door, watching the man's table. His brows knitted together, and he leaned toward the waitress as she walked by. "Hey, that guy in the corner, he's been waiting a while," he said softly. "I'll get to him," she snapped, brushing past him. The busba's eyes followed her, uncertain, but he didn't press further. Back at the booth, the elderly man leaned forward slightly, placing his hands on the table. He wasn't causing a scene, wasn't raising his voice, but his presence alone seemed to magnify the silence that surrounded him. And then the door to the diner opened again, and everything shifted. The bell above the diner door jingled, cutting through the tense air like a sharp knife. A woman in her early 30s stepped inside, her heels clicking confidently against the tiled floor. She wore a tailored blazer, her hair styled neatly, and carried an air of purpose that turned heads. She scanned the room, her gaze landing on the elderly man in the corner. Her face lit up with recognition, and she strode toward him with a warm, genuine smile. "Dad!" she exclaimed, her voice ringing out. The man's face softened immediately, a wide smile spreading across his features. He stood, and the two embraced tightly. The room, which had been buzzing with quiet tension, grew uncomfortably silent. Every eye was on the pair now. The waitress, who had been pouring coffee at another table, froze mid-pour, her hand trembling slightly. The young woman pulled back, her smile fading as she looked her father up and down. "You haven't been served yet?" she asked, her tone sharp and incredulous. The elderly man hesitated, glancing around the room before answering. "Not yet," he said simply, his voice steady. Her expression darkened, and she straightened, turning her attention to the waitress. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice cutting through the room. The waitress blinked, then turned slowly, her face pale. "Yes?" she said, her voice quieter than usual. "My father has been sitting here for nearly an hour. Why hasn't he been served?" the young woman demanded, her tone even but firm. The waitress opened her mouth, but no words came out. She glanced toward the kitchen as if hoping for backup, then stammered. I was just about to get to him." The young woman's eyes narrowed. "Really? Because it sure looks like you've been deliberately ignoring him." The waitress's face flushed red. She fumbled for an excuse. "It's been busy. I didn't mean to." The young woman held up a hand, cutting her off. "Don't lie to me. Everyone in this room saw what happened. You had no problem serving every other table." Murmurs broke out among the patrons. A few nodded subtly, their earlier discomfort now turning into quiet agreement. The tension in the room was palpable, but this time it wasn't just discomfort, it was accountability. The young woman turned back to her father, her expression softening. "I'm sorry, Dad. You shouldn't have had to deal with this." The elderly man smiled gently, patting her hand. "It's all right," he said, though his eyes betrayed a quiet hurt. But his daughter wasn't finished. She had one more thing to say that would leave the room in stunned silence. The young woman turned back to the waitress, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "Let me make one thing clear," she began, her voice carrying a weight that silenced even the faint whispers in the room. "That man you ignored for the past hour? He's not just a customer. He's my father. And I own this restaurant." The room seemed to freeze. Every head turned toward the waitress, whose face had drained of all color. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The weight of the revelation hung heavily in the air, pressing down on everyone in the diner. You own the place?" the waitress finally managed to whisper, her voice trembling. "That's right," the young woman replied, her tone unwavering. "I've poured my heart into this business. I built it to be a place where everyone feels welcome, regardless of who they are. And today, you've disrespected not only my father but everything this restaurant stands for." The waitress took a shaky step back, clutching the coffee pot in her hand as if it might anchor her. "I didn't mean to. She trailed off, her excuses sounding hollow even to her own ears. "You just what?" the young woman pressed, her voice rising slightly. "Thought you could decide who deserves respect and who doesn't? Thought no one would notice?" She gestured to the room. Well, everyone noticed. The patrons sat in stunned silence, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. A few exchanged guilty looks, remembering how they had chosen not to speak up earlier. The young woman scanned the room, her gaze landing on each table in turn. "And to the rest of you," she said, her voice softer now but no less firm. "Why didn't anyone say anything? Why did you all sit here and let this happen?" A man at the counter cleared his throat awkwardly. I didn't want to get involved," he muttered, looking down at his coffee cup. The young woman's eyes narrowed. Silence is complicity. When you see something wrong and say nothing, you're part of the problem. Her words lingered, cutting through the room like a knife. The elderly man placed a hand on his daughter's arm, his touch gentle. "Let it go, sweetheart," he said softly. "They've heard enough." She turned to him, her expression softening once more. "Dad, you deserve better. This shouldn't have happened." He smiled, a quiet strength in his eyes. "I know. But the lesson has been learned." The waitress, now visibly shaking, stammered, "I'm so sorry. I wasn't thinking. Please, I'll do better." The young woman stared at her for a long moment before nodding curtly. "You'll have the chance to prove it. But if I see anything like this again, you're done." The room was silent, heavy with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. But the lesson was far from over. The young woman stepped back and glanced around the room, her gaze steady. "This restaurant was built on the values of kindness and respect," she said, addressing everyone. "Not just because it's good for business, but because it's the right thing to do. Every person who walks through that door deserves to be treated with dignity. No exceptions." The waitress nodded vigorously. Her cheeks flushed with shame. "I promise I'll make it right. I'll apologize to him properly." "You'll do more than that," the young woman replied. "You'll reflect on why you acted the way you did today and make sure it never happens again. I'm giving you this chance because I believe people can change, but it's up to you to prove it." The waitress swallowed hard and nodded again. "I understand. Thank you." The young woman turned back to her father, her expression softening once more. "Let's get you that breakfast you came here for." But her father shook his head with a quiet chuckle. "I think I've lost my appetite for eggs and bacon. Let's go home, sweetheart." The patrons, who had remained silent for so long, began to stir. A woman from the far corner stood up hesitantly. "Ma'am," she said, her voice timid, "I want to apologize. I saw what was happening, and I should have spoken up. It wasn't right to just sit and watch." The elderly man smiled warmly at her. "Acknowledging it now is a start," he said. "The next time you see something, don't hesitate. Speak up. You might make all the difference." A few others began murmuring their agreements, their faces lined with guilt and a newfound resolve. The tension that had gripped the room was beginning to lift, replaced by an air of reflection. The young woman took her father's arm and led him toward the door. As they passed the waitress, she stopped and spoke quietly but firmly. "I expect better from you, for everyone's sake." "Yes, ma'am," the waitress said, her head bowed. As the father and daughter exited the diner, the sunlight outside seemed a little brighter. The elderly man paused, leaning on his cane, and looked at his daughter with pride. "You've become a remarkable woman," he said. She smiled back at him. "I learned from the best." Inside the diner, the staff and patrons were left to reflect, their usual morning routines disrupted by something far more important, a lesson about compassion, courage, and the power of doing what's right. The father and daughter walked down the bustling street together, their steps in sync as they moved away from the diner. The elderly man paused, his cane tapping lightly against the pavement. "You know," he said, his tone thoughtful, "sometimes it takes a moment like this to remind people what really matters." His daughter nodded. "You're right, Dad. People need to be reminded that their actions, or their silence, can have consequences. If no one speaks up, nothing changes." The elderly man smiled, his expression filled with quiet wisdom. "And you've done your part today, not just for me, but for everyone in that room." The two continued their walk, their bond stronger than ever, leaving behind a powerful example of standing up for what's right. Inside the diner, the lesson lingered, inspiring some to rethink their choices and others to resolve to do better in the future. What would you have done in that diner? Would you have spoken up? This story is a reminder of the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect, no matter who they are or where they come from. It's also a call to action for all of us. When you see something wrong, don't stay silent. Speak up. Take a stand. your voice might be the one that changes everything. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that inspire reflection and action. Let's make a difference together, one story at a time.